Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the Survive podcast. Today I'm joined by Tim O'Neill. He has a website called History for Atheists, and this interview is based on his blog article, "The Great Myths One: The Medieval Flat Earth," that you can find on his website, History for Atheists. I have a link to the article in the description below, so you can click on there and go read it yourself. That being said, thank you for joining me today, Tim.
Yeah, no problem at all, Jacob. Good to be back. I'm going to speak reasonably quietly because it's 5 in the morning here. I don't want to wake
Sure,
up the people up. So hopefully you can hear me okay.
but I can hear you well. Yes.
Yeah. So look, happy to talk about the whole concept of the medieval flat Earth belief, or the fact that they didn't actually believe that. But I thought maybe we could talk about what that myth means, because it's an extension of, I suppose, a wider myth that people in the Middle Ages were stupid and ignorant, and were kept stupid and ignorant by the Catholic Church, and that science generally kind of went backwards or didn't exist in the medieval period. And I think this is a myth that way too many of my fellow atheists accept, and a couple of more prominent ones kind of defend, some quite passionately or militantly. And frankly, it's nonsense, and it shouldn't be something that people promulgate simply because they don't like Christianity. I'm not a massive fan of Christianity, but I am a massive fan of getting history right. So, but let's start with the concept of people in the Middle Ages believing that the Earth is flat. I take it, Jacob, you've heard of this idea.
Yes, I have.
You
Definitely.
have, yeah. So it's one that's reasonably common still, though thankfully becoming a little bit less so. I think people are finally starting to get the message that it's not true. But unfortunately, there are people some quite prominent people who keep perpetuating it. So a few years ago, Neil deGrasse Tyson was having a argument on Twitter, as you do, with a rapper, a guy called, I think it's pronounced B.O.B., who's a flat earther. And unfortunately, the rise of online flat earthers is one of the lamentable side effects of the internet. And he was quite reasonably, because the flat earth is an idiot, trying to get this guy to see that the idea that the earth is flat is nonsense. But he then commented, he said, just to be clear, being 5 centuries regressed in your reasoning doesn't mean that we can't still like your music. And then someone sort of said, well, hang on, 5 centuries, surely the knowledge of the Earth's shape goes back a bit further than that. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, the great astrophysicist and science educator, said, yes, ancient Greece inferred from the Earth's shadow during lunar eclipses, which is true. And then said, but it was lost to the Dark Ages. So this is the idea. The idea is that, the ancient Greeks came up with the idea of the Earth being round. But then that was forgotten because the Catholic Church came along, with the Church generally came along and said, no, the Bible says that the Earth is flat. And so it was forgotten. And the way the myth goes is that was then challenged finally by Christopher Columbus, who argued that the Earth was round and proved it by sailing to the Americas. This is all complete crap. So to begin with, the church did not teach that the Earth was flat during the Middle Ages, and Christopher Columbus did not challenge the idea that the Earth was round, and he certainly didn't prove it by sailing to the Americas. You have to prove it by sailing around the entire planet, and that didn't happen until after Columbus. That happened with Magellan. But the idea that the medieval church taught that the Earth was flat is something that was invented in the 19th century, and it's a bit annoying that someone as prominent as Neil deGrasse Tyson perpetuates this myth. Another person who has been responsible for perpetuating this myth for years is the guy who calls himself a Ron Ra, the atheist, anti-creationist guy. Now, Ron Ra's a very popular guy because he is an anti-creationist, and good on him for that. But for many, many years, Ron Ra gave a kind of a talk about how Christianity suppressed science through the ages, particularly in the Middle Ages, and held up the example of the church teaching that the Earth was flat as evidence. And for years, people have been telling Ron Ra that he's wrong. And for years, Ron Ra has been ignoring them, ignoring all the evidence to the contrary, and continuing to perpetuate this myth. I eventually got Ron Ra a couple of years ago to admit that he's wrong on this. He didn't admit it very happily, and he tried to kind of support what he said in other ways. But he has finally, I think, got the message that this isn't true. So how do we know that people in the Middle Ages knew the Earth was round? Well, we got their writings, and they started off effectively by quoting the ancient Greeks. It's interesting, by the way, that the ancient Greeks did come up with the idea that the Earth was round, and pretty much no one else did. There's a new book that came out just a couple of weeks ago called Globe, How the Earth Became Round, by James Hannam. So James Hannam is a historian of science. He has a degree in physics from, I believe it's Oxford, and has a degree in the history of science from Cambridge. So he's not exactly an idiot. And he has written a really interesting book. He got me to read a couple of the chapters for him while he was in pre-publication. And it's basically, well, why did the Greeks come up with the concept of a spherical Earth when the Chinese, the Babylonians, pretty much everyone else continued, thought that the Earth was flat, and the Chinese continued to think the Earth was flat well into the modern era. So it wasn't until the influence of European science that the Chinese eventually, grudgingly, dropped the idea of a flat Earth. So a round Earth isn't something that was immediately obvious. But it's interesting that the Greeks were the ones who uniquely came up with it. And then it spread from ancient Greece to the rest of the Mediterranean world, so the Roman world. And then eventually it also spread to India. So the Indians didn't come up with it independently. They got that from the Greeks through the connection with Alexander the Great's empire and the Arabic world. So they got that from the Greeks. So it all started with the Greeks. But the medieval world also inherited that Roman idea of a spherical Earth, which the Romans got from the Greeks as well. So we've got early medieval writings by various guys, various medieval scholars, such as Bede or Macrobius, who simply matter-of-factly state that the Earth was round. They got this largely from Plato. So Plato in the Timaeus basically gives a very, very short but fairly sort of succinct and comprehensive description of the Earth as a sphere. And they basically thought, well, okay, if Plato says that must be true. Also, it kind of made sense. Things like the shape of the shadow of the Earth on the moon during an eclipse is evidence. The fact that a ship sailing over the horizon, basically you don't see the hull, and eventually you don't see the sails, and then eventually you don't see the tops of the mast. That kind of makes sense if it's sailing over a curved surface. So there were empirical and observational reasons for it, not just the authority of Plato. It's interesting, though, that if they had decided to pay more attention to other Greek philosophers, they possibly wouldn't have thought that the Earth was round, because there were other Greek philosophers after the concept of a round Earth was established by the Aristotelian and Platonic schools, who continued to think of the Earth as flat. So that's kind of interesting that the Epicureans, for example, seem to have maintained a flat Earth belief for a long time. So the idea that the Greeks believed that the Earth was round isn't accurate entirely, because there were some Greeks who didn't. But on the whole, the conception of the Earth as a sphere at the center of a concentric series of spheres, the celestial spheres, became the dominant cosmology, partly for rational and observational reasons and partly for metaphysical reasons. And that's something we have to remember with ancient Greek proto-science. It wasn't always and entirely a process of science in the sense that we think of science being purely measurement, observation, and reason. There was a hell of a lot of philosophy and metaphysics and a lot of stuff that we would actually consider kind of wacko going on as well. But the early medieval people, on the whole, seem to have got the idea that the Earth was round and maintained it. When I say on the whole, there are a couple of exceptions, and the exceptions are where the myth comes from. So there were a couple of medieval writers, one called Lactantius and the other called Cosmas, who seem to have maintained that flat Earth idea, partly out of influence from the Greek philosophers who didn't think the Earth was round, but largely out of influence from the Bible. Because the Bible, like all Near Eastern cosmologies, was a flat Earth cosmology. Some modern Christians try and pretend it wasn't. It was. So the Bible, when it talks about the Earth being, the shape of the Earth, actually assumes a flat Earth with a kind of a dome-like sky. But early Christians, and therefore early medieval Christians, inherited the Greek idea, on the whole, of a round Earth. And this was pretty much common. In the later Middle Ages, it was basically unquestioned. So the standard textbook on astronomy in medieval universities was a book called De Sphera Mundi, which means the sphere of the world. Now there the world means the cosmos, but the book actually goes through the basic arguments used originally by Aristotle on why the Earth is round and how we can know the Earth is round. And so this was pretty much standard and common knowledge. In fact, the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas, when he wanted to use an example of an accepted objective and what we would call scientific fact, he used the fact that the Earth is round as his example. So he says in his Summa Theologica, both the astronomer and a physical scientist may demonstrate the same conclusion, for instance, that the Earth is spherical. The first, however, works as a mathematical medium, prescinding from material quantities, while the second, his medium, is the observation of material bodies through the senses. So he's using this as an example of an objective fact that can be looked at from two different ways, objectively and scientifically, and is established and known. He wouldn't have used the round Earth as an objective fact if it wasn't something that everyone understood. So the idea that people in the Middle Ages thought that the Earth, scholars in the Middle Ages thought that the Earth was flat, is clearly wrong. So people sometimes try and say, well, yeah, okay, that was scholars, but everyone else thought the Earth was flat. Well, it's hard to know exactly what everyone else thought, and there probably were people who thought the Earth was flat. I mean, there are people today with everything that we have at our disposal with the modern education who still think the Earth is flat. So, yeah, there are stupid and ignorant people in any period. But when we look at the evidence as to what the average person seems to have understood, the evidence indicates that they also understood that the Earth was round. So, for example, one of the main ways that you communicated to the illiterate masses, literacy wasn't absolutely just the elite. There was a high level of literacy amongst the merchant classes and amongst the urban classes, high-ish. So medieval literacy could be anything up to about 20% of the population. But that still is 80% of the population who couldn't read at all. And the way you communicated with them was through the visual medium. So this is why medieval churches were filled with paintings. This is why you had stained glass windows. This is why medieval manuscripts had lots of pictures. It was a way of communicating visually. And one of the visual symbols was the symbol of the Earth, which was an orb. So that's a sphere. It wasn't a disc. So Jesus, for example, is often depicted sitting on a throne holding an orb. And it was an orb with a cross on the top, which indicated the dominion of God over the world. but the orb represented the world. So he's not sitting there holding a dinner plate or a frisbee, he's holding a globe. And therefore the visual language which people absorbed and understood was one of a spherical earth. That image of the earth as a globe, as an orb, was actually inherited from the Romans. But the language, the visual language, didn't change, which means that people's conception seems to have stayed pretty much with this idea of a spherical earth. We also get writings for popular audiences which refer matter-of-factly to the earth being round. So we have some stories, for example, about there's one in a book of Traveller's Tales called The Tales of Sir John Mandeville from the 14th century, which talks about a guy who leaves England and travels east and keeps traveling so far that he eventually comes back to his home from the west, which means he circumnavigated the world. Well, that really only makes sense if the earth is round. And the author doesn't explain this to his readers. He just tells the story. He expects them to understand it. We've also got some common expressions in French, in medieval French, referring to the earth as being round like a ball or round like an apple. So we've got plenty. There's masses of others, masses of other evidence, which indicates they understood that the earth was round. So what about the whole Columbus story? Well, that was invented in the 19th century by Washington Irving. So Washington Irving was the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He was a very, very famous author, and he was commissioned by his editors to write a life of Columbus. I can't remember the exact anniversary. It was an anniversary of Columbus's voyages. What was going on was this was the generation after the American Revolution. And so the United States was kind of looking for a bit of a mythology, a bit of a founding myth, and was starting to see Columbus as kind of like the founder figure. Now that he's kind of becoming a lot more problematic these days, but for a long time, Columbus was sort of seen as like, it was the first story that American kids learned about, brave Christopher Columbus who sailed across the ocean blue in 1492. Irving looked at the story of Columbus and actually found it wasn't a very interesting story, so decided to make up a better story. So what he did was he made up a story where Columbus came up with the concept of the earth being round by looking at ancient Greek sources, and decided to do his voyage because he thought he could sail to the Indies around Earth, and was opposed by the Catholic Church. This is also in a period where anti-Catholicism was pretty strong in the United States. It was before the immigration of a lot of migrants from Ireland and Italy, so where the Catholic population in the US was quite small, and anti-Catholic sentiment was pretty high. So it was, I suppose, a vehemently Protestant country. They didn't like Catholics. So one of the problems with Christopher Columbus was that he was a Catholic. So one of the ways that Irving kind of changed the story was he made Christopher Columbus into a kind of a proto-Protestant by having him arguing with the Catholic Church over this idea of the earth being flat, and of course being proven right. And so Christopher Columbus is smart and wise, and the Catholic Church is stupid. The only problem is this is all made up. There was no dispute over the shape of the earth. There was a dispute over its size. So everyone, as I've already explained, everyone knew that the earth was round. The question was about its size. So way back in the 2nd century, Aristophanes had worked out basically the size of the earth, calculated it using some basic geometry, and was more or less right. What we don't hear about quite so much is the fact that he wasn't the only person in the ancient world who calculated the size of the earth. There were several others, and one of them was Ptolemy, who wrote a very influential series of books and came up with a quite different and much smaller estimate. So what Columbus did was he took Ptolemy's estimate and then kind of made it smaller again on the basis of some fairly specious logic, and then used that to say, well, if I sail west from Spain, I will be able to get to Japan, which is where he was trying to get to, without running out of food and water. And so he got his funding from Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain on the basis of this rather crappy argument. He was completely wrong. And his size of the Earth, his conception of the Earth was completely wacko as well. But he was lucky in that he crashed into the West Indies and Caribbean, and at around about the point where he thought he was going to get to China, to Japan, and he thought he was somewhere in the Indies. He thought he was somewhere like some islands slightly off the coast of Japan, and again was completely wrong. I'm not a massive fan of Columbus, I must say. But the myth is of course that he came up with the idea of a round Earth and argued with the Catholic Church and proved that they were wrong. It's complete garbage. So that's where the story began, and unfortunately, because it plays into this idea of the Middle Ages as a period of ignorance, stupid superstition, as a dark age. The Catholic Church is suppressing scientific ideas. And the whole idea of that period being one of like ignorance and stupidity, it's an idea that just sort of sticks around, which is why it took 20 years for people to finally convince Ron Ra that he was wrong, and that the medieval people did not believe that the Earth was flat; they believed it was round. That's it in summary. You got any questions on it?
We do have a couple of super chats. Brett Forsyth, thank you for your super chat. I'm not a flat earther, but have you read books that give evidence for a flat earth, i.e. Zetetic Astronomy, Earth Not a Globe by Sam Rothbaum, 100 Proofs that the Earth is Not a Globe, and others?
No. No. I've got a limited amount of time which to read, and there are so many good books by esteemed scholars on fascinating subjects. I'm going to spend my time reading that, not crap like this. So anyone who thinks that the Earth is flat is a fucking idiot. So no, I haven't read those books, and I have no intention of doing so. I can't believe someone asked that question.
And we got another one from Brett again. Thank you for the super chat again. How and why do you think a flat Earth truth movement has become an anti-Semitic theme? Many claim NASA is controlled by the Jews. Any thoughts on the new Swabia Nazi Germany existing there?
I've never heard of new Swabia, but I suppose I don't really follow the Nazis that closely. Why do any of these stupid ideas become connected with other stupid ideas? I think probably because they're largely held by stupid people. Anti-Semitism gets itself connected to a whole lot of strange and stupid ideas because you basically get strange and stupid people talking to each other about their strange and stupid ideas. Why is the flat Earth truth movement? Why does it have an anti-Semitic theme? Well, apparently the Jews control everything. So, of course, they're controlling us to try and make us believe that the flat Earth is round or something. I mean, fucking hell. Seriously, I think we must live in the stupidest period in the whole of history. People talk about the medieval period being a period of stupidity and ignorance. So like they would not be able to hold a candle to us. I mean, honestly, I despair sometimes. I'm probably much more interested to go with the guys in the history rather than whatever's going on at the moment. So if I'm being dismissive about this stuff, maybe there are other guests that Joe could get on to talk about why. I think it's astonishing that we'd have to do this, but to talk about why the Earth is round. But I'm not interested in the arguments of the current crop of flat Earth dickheads. I'm interested in history.
Is Neil deGrasse Tyson still promoting the idea that in the medieval period, people believed the Earth was flat, or has he also come to realize that they did not believe it like Ron Ra did?
Yeah, I think he has. There's a guy that I'm in touch with who's not a big fan of Neil deGrasse Tyson, and has brought some of this stuff to Tyson's attention. The thing about Tyson is that he's one of these people who seems to think that because he's an expert on one thing, he's an expert on everything, and he's got a very bad habit of making pronouncements about history, which are wrong. So I've recently written a fairly detailed article on another idea that he spread, which is that the Islamic Golden Age was on the brink of a scientific revolution, but it was destroyed when a guy, theologian called Al-Ghazali, popped up and said, studying mathematics is the language of the devil, and this guy single-handedly destroyed the flowering of science under the Islamic golden age during the period of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. That's complete crap, and historians of science debunked that. That was another 19th century idea, and the historians of science debunked that like 100 years ago. Yet Neil deGrasse Tyson keeps repeating it, and he keeps using it as this sort of like fairy tale of why we shouldn't allow religion to dictate what we believe. Well, I agree with him on not allowing religion to dictate what we believe about science, but if you're going to tell that, teach that, then you need to actually get your history right. And Al-Ghazali did not say that mathematics was the language of the devil. He actually encouraged the study of science, and there was no decline in science in the Islamic world. It continued. It declined after the Mongols sacked Baghdad, because that tends to happen. But it popped up in other parts of the Islamic world, in Spain, then later on in Samarkand and various other places. It ticked along quite happily. So Neil deGrasse Tyson is not a good guide when it comes to the study of history. He tweeted a few years ago where he was talking about an observation of a supernova in China, and said, this was while Europe was mired in the Dark Ages. So I had to point out to him that we've got a couple of examples, not of observations of that supernova, but of observations of other supernovas in the Middle Ages in Europe. So they weren't mired in the Dark Ages. They might not have seen that one, but they saw other ones. I'm not. I think it's great that Neil deGrasse Tyson is carrying on the legacy of Carl Sagan in popularizing the areas that he actually does know about, which are things like astrophysics and astronomy. But he's shit when it comes to history. Absolutely terrible. And he's also got some major prejudices which make him an unreliable guy. One of those major prejudices is he buys this whole idea of the Whig view of history. So the Whig view of history is that history is a matter of progress, but every now and then you get these steps backwards. So there are good periods of history like the ancient Greeks and the Romans. There are bad periods of history like the medieval period. And then you've got other good periods of history like the Renaissance. This is a very 19th century idea, and it's a very common idea, and it's the basis of a concept called the conflict thesis, also known as the Draper-White thesis, which is about how religion and science have been in conflict down through the ages. Unfortunately, this idea is common despite the fact it's wrong. It's not to say that there haven't been periods or points of conflict or incidents of conflict between religion and science. So the obvious one is the conflict between Darwinian evolution and traditional Christian ideas, which is ongoing with, unfortunately, with the prevalence of creationism, particularly in the United States. But those instances are not a general pattern. On the whole, science and religion throughout history have kind of bumped along reasonably happily, because they have sort of informed each other. And Newton, for example, was a deeply and profoundly religious guy who tells us that he was inspired by his religion to study the universe. And we get the same thing from other prominent figures in the history of science. Kepler is another one who was profoundly religious and was inspired by his religion to examine the workings of the universe, thinking about those workings of the universe as being expressions of the mind of God. So science and religion can actually work together, and through most of its history, kind of has. It's only occasionally that you get conflicts. The other one that everyone talks about is Galileo, which I have to do an entire program on. But let's just say, in very brief summary, that the Galileo affair was much more about politics than it was about science and religion. In fact, the church had the scientific consensus of its day firmly on its side, and Galileo was the one who was very much in the minority. Galileo was also wrong about most things. He was just right about the whole heliocentric thing, but maybe that's another program. So yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think, should stick to science, because he doesn't have a good grasp of the history of science, which is a completely separate discipline. Scientists on the whole don't get taught the history of science at all, or they don't get taught it very well. So the people to pay attention to on the history of science are historians, people who actually specialise in that area. Maybe we should talk about the broader myth, Jacob, about the church suppressing science in the Middle Ages.
Sure.
Okay. Let me read you a quote. Had Christianity not interrupted the intellectual advance of mankind and put the progress of science on hold for 1,000 years, that's the 1,000 years of the medieval period, the scientific revolution might have occurred 1,000 years ago. Now, science and technology today would be 1,000 years more advanced. So this is an expression of this idea that the medieval church, Christianity generally, kind of put the brakes on science for the entire medieval period. And as this person argues, we would be 1,000 years ahead of where we are now if that hadn't happened. This is a really common idea. It's a really common idea among atheists. I hear this stuff all the time. Jacob, any guesses as to who wrote that quote?
Nothing comes to mind right now. Go ahead and tell me.
His name is, I don't know if you've heard of him, his name is Richard Carrier. Have you heard of him?
Yes.
Okay. So this is Richard Carrier writing in one of John Loftus's books on why Christianity is bad. The quote, though, actually comes from this book, which is called Newton's Apple and Other Myths About Science, which is a collection of essays by leading historians of science, debunking myths. And that quote comes at the beginning of the very first chapter of this book. And the myth that they were debunking is that there was no scientific activity between Greek antiquity and the scientific revolution. And the article is written by Michael H. Schenck. Michael H. Schenck is a professor of the history of science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a leading historian of science. And he starts with that quote by Richard Carrier and then goes on to say, Carrier's full of shit. He doesn't actually mention Carrier by name, but he starts with that quote to encapsulate the myth and then writes an article summarizing what actual historians of science believe. He's also the co-editor of the second volume of the Cambridge History of Science, which is probably about as authoritative as it gets. The Cambridge History of Science, by the way, that second volume is on medieval science, and it's 698 pages long. So if there was no science, if the Catholic Church and Christianity generally suppressed science for that 1,000-year period, how could the professor of the history of science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with his co-author, the late David C. Lindbergh, who was probably the greatest historian of pre-modern science until his death a few years ago, how could they have written 698 pages on medieval science? Was it 698 pages saying the Catholic Church suppressed everything over and over again? Or maybe Richard Carrier is wrong. David C. Lindbergh, by the way, also wrote another book called Science in the Middle Ages. As you can see, it's reasonably extensive. So there kind of was a whole lot of science going on in the Middle Ages. So clearly Carrier is wrong. The truth is that Christianity actually came to a kind of accommodation with the ancient Greek world and its learning fairly early on. So there was a debate within Christianity in the early period, from about the 2nd century onwards, about whether this ancient Greek learning that they had kind of inherited was to be embraced and absorbed, or whether it was to be rejected. And there were certainly some people in that period, second, third, fourth century, who argue we don't need that stuff. That stuff is pagan, it's profane, it's not, it doesn't come from God. We've got Holy Scripture, that's got all the information in it that we need. So we'll just stick to the Bible, thanks. And quite often what you find is people who try and make this argument that Christianity suppressed ancient Greek science, they cherry pick some of the quotes from these people who were making that case. So the famous one is Tertullian, who said, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? So what is philosophy, including natural philosophy, what we call science or Greek proto-science, got to do with Jerusalem, Christian theology? And so they take that kind of quote, and others like it, and say this was the attitude of the early Christians. This set the tone for the medieval period, and that's why they rejected ancient Greek science. The problem with that is that it takes one side of a debate, because as I said, there was a debate about this, and those guys who made that argument that we can reject this pagan science, they lost the debate. And that's the bit that people like Carrier don't tell you, right? They lost the debate. The guys who won the debate were people like Clement of Alexandria. Now, he argued all wisdom ultimately comes from God. So if it's true, it's true. It doesn't matter where you get, what conduit you get the information through. It's all ultimately God's truth and God's religion. So he used the analogy of learning and wisdom being like an ocean. He said, like, just as an ocean is fed by many streams and many rivers, so the ocean of the wisdom of God is fed from many different tributaries. And some of these are Christian. Some of these come from the ancient Jewish tradition of the encapsulated in the Old Testament, and some are not. Some are pagan. Ultimately, though, they all head in the same direction. So what we should do is actually embrace this ancient Greek knowledge, because the Greeks were given a special gift by God. So just as the Jews were given a special gift for revelation, for mystical apprehension of God's truth and God's wisdom, the Greeks were given a special gift for rational analysis. And it would be stupid of us to reject that gift. So he argued that what they should do is they should, instead of just rejecting pagan knowledge altogether, they should look at it carefully, maybe disagree with some of it, but that was pretty standard for ancient Greek philosophers anyway, but embrace the stuff that seemed to make sense and which seemed to work. And actually a hell of a lot of that natural philosophy, so that the proto-science, it wasn't really modern science, but I might get back to that. But a hell of a lot of it just had absolutely no theological implications whatsoever. So it was like, okay, the earth is round, for example. If the earth is round, and the argument seemed to be that the earth is round, then we accept that. Okay, what if the Bible says that the earth, or seems to say that the earth is flat? Well, maybe the people writing the Bible didn't really know much about the shape of the earth. So they kind of argued correctly that the people who wrote the Bible and seemed to be writing about the earth being flat were using the language of their time and their understanding. And so that can be read allegorically, it can be read symbolically, it can be read poetically, because that's pretty much how most Christians read it today. So they came up with that concept. But also, if someone is looking at geometry, geometry is geometry. It doesn't really have any kind of theological implications. So most of this stuff, natural philosophical stuff, they were quite happy to absorb. There were bits of it that they disagreed with. So Aristotle believed, for example, that the universe was eternal, whereas Christianity teaches that the universe has a beginning in time. It was created by God. So they didn't say Aristotle should be thrown out. What they said was, well, Aristotle wrote a whole lot of really useful stuff, which we can happily absorb and happily use. This bit, though, is wrong. Same with Plato. Plato said had a belief in the transmigration of souls, so almost like a reincarnation. Obviously, they thought that was wrong, but they thought he was right about a whole lot of other stuff, and he was generally accepted. So there is an argument that you sometimes hear where people say, well, yeah, they did preserve some ancient Greek knowledge, but only the stuff they agreed with, only the people they agreed with. That's not true. They preserved a hell of a lot of stuff that they disagreed with. They just sort of said, well, he's wrong about that bit, but he's okay on this stuff. So the idea that they rejected science is completely wrong. But there was a period in Western Europe where a hell of a lot of this ancient Greek knowledge was lost. And this is often blamed on the Catholic Church. So it's often said, well, the Catholic Church came into control, and that's when all this stuff was lost. Therefore, it must have been because the Catholic Church condemned it and didn't propagate it. So correlation must mean causation. The only problem with that is it's not what happened at all. So what actually happened was that loss of that knowledge was as a result of a number of largely political and economic factors, which began before Christianity became prominent and were exacerbated by particularly the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. So what happened was, up until about the 3rd century, most educated people in west of the Mediterranean, so the western half of the Roman Empire, were literate in Latin, but also literate in Greek. So they read both languages. And you studied both Greek and Latin classical works. And if you went to the more advanced levels of education, you studied this natural philosophy, most of which was actually in Greek. So you read the works of people like Aristotle. You read logical works. You read medical works, depending on your area of specialization. What happened, though, was in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire nearly fell apart. It broke into 3 pieces at one point and eventually kind of stitched itself back together. But this is a period that's known as the military anarchy. There were about 100 emperors in the space of 50 years. Some of them lasted like a matter of weeks. Civil wars raged across the Roman Empire. War became endemic. There were barbarian invasions because the barbarians on the outside the Roman Empire saw the weakness of the empire and moved in. And the whole place very nearly fell apart. A series of emperors towards the end of the 3rd century managed to kind of stitch things back together. But the damage of that period, particularly in the western half of the empire, continued. And what part of the damage was, it disrupted education. It also particularly disrupted the state funding of education. And it meant that education changed in its orientation. There was a militarization of the Roman administration, which meant that a hell of a lot of people who, in the past possibly would have gone on to more advanced study and studied this natural philosophy and studied Greek in order to read those books, ended up going into the army and the military administration. So there was a militarization of the ruling classes, which meant that there was a dumbing down of the education from about the 3rd century into the 4th century. And then in the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire fell apart completely. So you then had an almost total loss of state funding for education and a localization, so a kind of disintegration of the infrastructure of education. Now, there still were schools, but they were largely dominated by the church. The church was a literate organization. It needed to keep education going. But what happened was that there was a kind of like a dumbing down of the level of education, not because the church hated science, but because a hell of a lot of the material that had been used had been lost, because far fewer people, almost no one, was literate in Greek anymore. And so the works that were technical works, on works like Archimedes, on more advanced subjects, were in Greek. Fewer people could read Greek. Fewer people had the motivation or time to read Greek. And so those works eventually got copied less and less and less and eventually were lost. So this is why we have this period from the 3rd century through to about the 9th century, where things got to a fairly low ebb when it came to education in the Latin West. But in the Greek-speaking East, things actually continued more or less as they always had. So all of those works, all those the ones that were lost in the West, continue to be copied and studied and commented on and read in the great academies and schools of the Eastern Roman Empire, what we eventually modern historians refer to as the Byzantine Empire. And outside the Byzantine Empire, you had this whole network of Christian schools which continued that legacy, which still studied Aristotle and Plato and Demosthenes and all these Greek classics, but studied them in Syriac translations. So we have this whole network of Syriac learning, quite advanced learning, which maintained those Greek classics in translation. Those guys then passed that information on to the Muslims. So when the Arab expansion began and the Muslim conquest of parts of the Eastern Roman Empire and the whole of the Parthian Empire happened in the 7th and 8th centuries, eventually those guys got hold of these Greek classics and largely via both Greek but also Syriac translations, translated them into Arabic. And then via Arabic, they found their way back into the Latin West. So from about the 11th century onwards, you had Christian scholars, Catholic scholars, who were hungry for this stuff, going to Muslim Spain and Muslim Sicily, studying with Muslim scholars, getting these Arabic translations of these lost Greek works, because they really wanted this stuff, translating it into Latin, and then it found its way back into the Latin West. That's what happened. Now, does that sound like Christianity saying we hate Greek science? No. So what you actually get from about the 12th century onwards is, because there was this kind of injection of, for them, new ancient knowledge, there was this great interest in natural philosophy, which was really stimulated in the universities, which were starting to pop up in medieval Europe. And that was the foundation for eventually what became the scientific revolution. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons why the scientific revolution seems to have happened in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries rather than, say, in the Islamic world. But there were medieval foundations to the scientific revolution, which, in the argument of historians of science like Edward Grant, probably means that scientific revolution wouldn't have happened if those medieval foundations weren't in place. And that's why we got whole books of stuff that was happening in the Middle Ages in Europe. Now, massive advances in science? No. But fundamental stuff was definitely happening. And one of those fundamentals was empiricism. So accurate measurement of time, of space, and a kind of a quantification of the world that to a level of and degree of precision that had not been seen before. So there's a very good book on that called The Measure of Reality, Quantification in Western Society, 1250 to 1600, which talks about this medieval to early modern process of quantification. That's by a guy called Alfred W. Crosby. Put links in the description as well. That was a fundamental change. That was something that was actually quite significant. And that measurement process was actually one of the major contributions of medieval science to the history of science, which means that they weren't doing amazing sort of new discoveries, but what they were doing was laying the methodological foundations for what came later on. Another book that I would highly recommend is a book by Seb Falk, who's another historian of science, The Light Ages. And yes, he's deliberately making that title a contrast to the concept of the Dark Ages, a medieval journey of discovery. This is a really readable book on, unlike a couple of the others I've mentioned, which are kind of dry, on medieval science. And the good thing about what Seb does is he doesn't overstate things. So he counters the myth of the medieval Dark Age of, carrier stuff about 1,000 years of darkness and so on. But he doesn't go the other way and say, oh, yeah, actually it was a period of great innovation. But he does talk about things like that quantification process that I talked about before. One of the great contributions of medieval science to the world was the clock. Now, we kind of take clocks for granted, but clocks were actually, we had water clocks and so on in the ancient world. There was a very, very complicated mechanical clock invented in China. But the medieval invention of the mechanical clock was the basis for pretty much every element of information technology which has come since. And Seth Falk does a really good job of talking about how the medieval clock invention began and the significance that it had. And when we're talking about clocks in the Middle Ages, they didn't just tell the time. They were incredibly complicated calculating machines, mechanical calculation machines driven by weights that could calculate the positions of the stars, the position of the tide at London at a particular time. There's one clock, Richard of Wellington's clock from the 14th century, which took 7.5 years to run through its full cycle of calculations. It was one of the most complicated, in fact, probably the most complicated machine that had ever been built up to that point. So these people weren't idiots, and they weren't unscientific. They did use reason, but unfortunately, we like to denigrate them because it makes us feel better. And this is why people like Richard Carrier, who unfortunately is not a good historian because he has an axe to grind against Christianity. And so he warps his view. And so he's constantly cherry-picking bits of evidence and presenting a tiny part of the picture, whereas real historians tell the whole picture in an objective and balanced way. I'm going to take a breath. Any questions?
Well, we don't have any super chats right now. I think my closing question would be, what do you think is causing the flat Earth movement to be revived in the modern period right now?
The flat Earth movement?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm old enough to remember the early days of the internet. I first got online in 1992, and I tell my nephews that was back when before the internet had pictures or video, and they look at me like I was insane. So back then, the internet was very small, and it was largely academics and people at NASA and people at various universities, which is where I was, talking to each other, and it was great. And we had great hopes that when this thing got bigger, it would bring about this great sort of democratization of knowledge. We had very high idealistic hopes about the internet. What we didn't realize was that it would also lead, because it has led to that, but it would also lead to a democratization of stupidity. And unfortunately, what has happened is people who used to sit on their own and come up with crazy ideas about the Jews, telling us that the earth is flat, now find each other really easily. So a friend of mine used to collect crazy pamphlets. He had a whole box full of them, and they were like these hand-typed things that he found stuck up on notice boards with all this stuff about the Jews are doing various terrible things. He was Jewish. So he had a whole collection of them. This is how people back then used to propagate and promulgate their stupid ideas. Now they get on Twitter. So what's driving it? I think it's the same thing that's driving all kinds of stupid stuff that we're seeing at the moment. The anti-vax stuff, conspiracy theories about COVID, Q, all of this garbage. What's happening is that people can find their fellow idiots and can convert others, and then can get themselves into bubbles where they just reinforce this nonsense, and it becomes very, very difficult to penetrate it. So I think it's the democratization of the stupid. It's kind of depressing, to be honest.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Tim.
No problem. Thanks, Joe. Happy to talk about any of this stuff in more detail if anyone has any questions.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.